Hi, this is Mark Franks with Acumatica. I'm your host today for the 12th episode of Coffee and Code. It's been a few months since our last one, but we've been busy. We've had the DevCon and we just finished up our internal hackathon. So I wanted to get on the schedule a topic that I thought everyone would be interested in. It's Acumatica Attributes. Evgeny Krakow is on the call. He, about 18 months ago, maybe it's a year, I can't remember exactly. He did an excellent presentation on the subject. So he had a bunch of PowerPoints. I think he did some sample code and so forth and demonstrated it. And so I will in the vlog part and the write-up of this, once I've done the editing and so forth and actually published this, I'll have a link to that presentation. And so there's that. But today, like all Coffee and Code, it's really just a casual conversation among developers. We have Acumatica developer MVPs on the call. We have internal devs and engineers on the call as well. And so we just hope this will be a useful episode for you. So Stéphane, who actually is sharing the screen right now, he was our latest developer of the year. He has a lot of experience on the platform. He's really a really great back-end programmer, and he's done a lot of great work for us. That's why he was the developer of the year last year, and he's agreed to kind of lead the discussion, if you will, and start talking about it. So, Stéphane, with that, I'll let you kind of introduce the topic a little more, if you'd like.
Yes. So, attributes. Who doesn't know about attributes? We think we know a lot, but there's so much to learn that I think we'll never see the end of it. And the more we learn, the more Acumatica creates new attributes anyway. So we have to catch up. But you have to start somewhere, right? So everybody sees my screen, I guess, right? So where did I start? At first, obviously, I was like most of us. You start to use the attributes that you have available. But after a point, you want to start creating your own because you want to, mostly bring functionality together. You want to reduce your code. You want to do more complex things and mostly save time, I would say. So the first thing I ever did basically is creating a copy of a well-known attribute. Some of you, I've seen it over and over, the ACCT sub attribute, which Acumatica. So why did I create mine instead? Well, for multiple reasons. When I started this, the one from Acumatica actually had a bug with the selector. So it's the version from Acumatica is assuming that your field will probably be a segmented key or some kind, so like a customer code, a supplier code, an item, and I think it was too specific for me. I wanted a more generic approach to be reusable in all kinds of situations. So I created my own version. I guess I could go back to Acumatica's version now that it has improved, a lot. So basically, the idea is that your attribute is a PX aggregate attribute. So that's the first powerful thing, if you will. An aggregate attribute is basically aggregating multiple attributes together in one single attribute that you can use, and it makes your code much simpler. And I'll give you some example. And essentially, what it does is it groups attributes together. It's initialize them, when the cache is attached, as we all know, and then you have all these properties, these setters and getters, that you can call on your attribute, which will set the appropriate property on the appropriate attribute that is aggregated in the group, right? So this is obviously like I said, a copy of the Acumatica's attribute, but I've added a bunch of functions to it, and you can keep adding, and it becomes a very, I think, very nice tool to have. And I'll show you how I use them. So once you have your aggregate attribute, let me find an example here. So let me see this one. It's the DAC. So let me see. So that's one of the standard one from Acumatica, like I said. So I guess we could subclass one of those, but mine is more generic. So here's an example. So I just basically declare a new class, which I subclass my aggregate attribute, and then I basically put all these attributes on top of it. So typically you need a DB field of some kind. Possibly you will need a default. And also typically when you use these as keys, you will need a referential integrity check to make sure that you don't delete records that you are using. So that's the first thing I do. Second thing I do is typically for each kind of, and this is mostly for key fields, I tend to create, let me see, like this one here is for the primary key of the table. So I have a table called standards and I have an ID on it and we'll see it later. And so I have this key and also create a foreign key version of it, which is a little different. So this one is a GUID, but it's not auto-created. It's a reference, so it's a selector basically. And then one thing I can do here is in my declaration is I'm going to pass it a where clause, and I'm going to create my selector automatically. So I don't have to worry about that, and I don't pollute my code. So if I search, let me search for those fields. So go to find all references. And then I'll go to the other one too. So now in my DAC, the only thing I have is my class that represents my BQL field, my property here, and I have my attribute. So as you can see, very clean. And I do that now for a lot of my fields. You can see here, I have AL name and I have AL active. So typically, that's what I like. I like to have my field, my property, and my attribute, and that's it. So it gives you very clean code, and it allows you to reuse the functionality over and over. So it forces you to think about your attributes in a more generic way. But once you have done that, you can reuse and reuse and reuse. And I reuse these active flags all over the place. I reuse these. These keys are these tables are, they have a key which is a GUID, but what you see is the name, you know, a little bit like the IDCD. And I've mentioned that in one of my blogs about primary keys. So the classic is IDCD. This one is more like GUID and name. And this is what Acumatica does. For example, generic inquiries, business event, they all use this pattern of a GUID as the primary key and a name on top of it to search for it. So you don't see the GUID, obviously it's hidden. But you can see here, just one line of code and my attribute is all done. And I use that in all of my DACs. So I save a tremendous amount of time, because if I need another DAC, I just basically copy another one and the attributes are already there. I just remove the fields I don't need, add a few more one. That's it. So I can create a DAC in virtually sometimes 5 minutes, right? And that's the idea, is it allows you to go very fast. So that's for the key. And like you can see here in my project, I have an attribute folder, and you can see I create a lot of those. And they become specialized, but they save me a lot of time. And again, if I want to have another type of field, like here I have question ID, I have answer ID here. So basically you need another attribute, just copy and paste, rename it, and you go there, and you know, you have almost nothing to do. And the foreign equivalent of the field referencing to the table will have typically a selector either directly in it, or like I showed earlier here, as a dynamic selector, which can have a different where clause. So for example, I did a search earlier. Let me find a reference to that. So here I want a selector but I want to see all the rows. So I just pass it a where true equals true, because I don't really have a condition. If I don't give it a condition, I will have no selector. And if I want another selector with other conditions, I just pass my where clause here, which means I can use this in any DAC I want and create a selector dynamically based on where I am now. So I could reuse the same field with different conditions, right? So the idea, again, is reusability as much as possible.
So Stéphane,
yes.
So Stéphane, before you go on, this is awesome. Marco had a question. He had his hand up. Marco, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. It was actually two questions. One, you already answered by showing all your attribute libraries. I see you have one file per attributes, but you could easily group those, like depending on the use you have, right? Like have a collection of all the common attributes.
You could have all
file.
for example, for all your forest key together, all your primary keys together. Yeah,
right.
I have a tendency to create one file per class. I don't like to, because I'm a very visual person. So if I scroll like here, I can find quickly, oh, I'm looking for this. You see the owl name attribute, which I showed, is here. And this one is a little bit fancier, and you can see it has actually a selector too. So I like to go through my project like this. I could find my class, but if you want, you could have one file and group all your things.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Cut and paste. And furthermore, I mean, I'm sure, because a lot of this is repeating, I'm sure something like that, for example, where it says AL model ID, could actually, all your primary keys could actually inherit from another class, which would be a GUID, right? And you just say AL model ID is an AL ID attribute, right? So then again, less code. And your foreign keys could be the same. Your foreign keys would be a little bit more trickier because they tend to, well, this one doesn't have, but let me see. No, this one I'm not using anymore. This one here. So this one has a selector, and you have a relationship between this, right, the name, and another table. But you could make you could make it generic and have an attribute like that, and have something like that. But then you would probably need, something like that, ID key, ID field, and then most probably description field, right?
Yeah, either make it generic or add it as a parameter.
Yeah, so then I would select the table like this, right? Or table, not the table, but the ID field,
right,
as such. And then I would have my, I don't know if I'm going to use my table. Here I have my field, and so I would probably need more like a, let's say, name field instead. So I would have my name field here, and I would have this, right?
Now you make it generic.
Well, and as a matter of fact, I would need the type of, because it would already be a type.
It's already a type, right?
Yeah, it's already a type, so it would be something like that.
Yeah, and the other question I had, it's more in a general sense, like if and perhaps Mark, opening a little the conversation for everyone, if you could, Stéphane, give us like a quick summary of things that we can do with the attributes, like the benefits of the attributes, like how they can easily be linked to events in the graphs.
I was going there slowly.
Right.
Slowly, but that's another, let's say that's the next level, right, if you will.
Right. Yeah, this is like see what you can do. Okay, now let's talk about all the benefits. Yeah, I really like how you take all the benefits of the attributes and
yeah, and if we would go a step further, we could have basically, even in the aggregate like this, I would have probably nothing here, right? And I would say it's a AL ID attribute, and then possibly I would say of AL model or something like that, right? Something like that. And even if we put an interface, we could put an interface on AL model, and then you know, we could put an interface and say I'm just making up things, right? You would create a master table interface, so that would be iMaster table, and then that would be an interface, right? So let me create a quick file. So public interface, and then I would have a I would need a way to get my primary I would need a way to get my essential field, let's call them like this, right? So you would have a type here, and you would have ID field, and you would have name field, and you would have a description field. Something like that, right? Let me and then I need my obviously my getter here. Oops. Something like that, right? So I have this now. I would have a where's my, I'm destroying all my stuff here, but it doesn't matter. So here I would have let's say master, and then I would say where, actually I would put the master here too instead. And then I would say where master, and I would put my something like that, right? Obviously this doesn't, and now what I used to have here, let me copy this. I'm doing code live. I like that. Okay, so I would go, okay, so let's copy it here. So this guy here would be like this. So it would be a, not this one though. To delete. So I would start here, like something like that. And then I would make a generic ID like this. Right, so that's the same thing. So this guy here would be an aggregate, and it would have all this, right? So now I could go back here and go to my model ID, and I would just have to say something like that, and I will say AL model here, and that would disappear, right? And then in my AL AD model, I would have here my master, and then I would have here my where master column, and my interface was iMaster table, I believe. Right? So then this guy here would know how to find the fields, right? So I should have done it on the foreign. This one here. Let me see. Which one was I using earlier? You see, that's the proof that I maybe have like this one here would be more suitable for it, right? So this one would be a let me see here. No, not this one. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that would be so this would be a ID foreign attribute of AL font. Now it's going to complain because, well, first of all, this has to exist. So let me go back here. Let's cheat a little bit here. Right. And so it says now, well, this guy cannot be, you cannot do this because AL font, is not a iMaster. But then I put my interface here, iMaster table like this, and then I would implement my interface, right? Where's my interface?
Bottom.
Yeah, that's funny. Let me see. Yeah, there it is. Okay, thank you. So here I would say this would be the this guy here. Let me bring that up here. So this guy would be this. And I said actually type, but I should have said it's a BQL. It's a BQL field. So I could have said something like that, right? And then I can return font ID. Could have been like that, right? And then same thing for my, so it means now my attribute, which is super generic, which is the AL, not this guy, the AL, where's it? Foreign. This guy here.
Model.
Yeah, so this guy now has access to the fields, so he could actually implement a selector on it without really knowing what table it's selecting on, right? So then, by a simple declaration of one line of code, which was I was trying to make here, I could say my AL model ID is an ID, and my AL foreign model ID is an AL foreign ID of AL model. Then everything becomes generic. So one line of code, you create an attribute, which is itself an aggregate attribute, and it does all the rest for you, right? So now I'm destroying my code. That was not my intent, though. But yeah, I'll reverse it after. It's not a problem.
Yes. So that's very powerful, obviously, right?
Yeah, but so obviously I do this on my own. But if we were to develop all these tools among us, to create an ID field, which is a GUID, having a name, we could quickly create DAX and without having to worry. So I think it's good that we have attributes, but we could go so much further, right?
Yep. So let's open up the discussion a little bit, and then we can move on if, so we'll just have, it's open-ended. So depending on how long people want to stay, but is anyone else on the call, any Acumatica engineers that want to comment, or any dev MVPs that have questions or comments around what you've seen so far?
No, I can say one concern which I have regarding attributes. Like, I use attributes and I use them sometimes heavily, of course. But there is one thing which I'm not very happy about attributes is that, let's say, if we get on our team new Acumatica developer and he sees code which is heavily relied on attributes, I need to have bigger estimates, because like if somebody just starts with Acumatica and he passed, for example, Acumatica manuals, and then he need to have another manuals on attributes usage. So that's something that's like to keep in balance, I would say.
Yeah, but I think in the end, maybe the ramp up will be slightly higher, but in the end, it will produce less code with more functionality and probably go faster developing its code. Because if you, I remember in the beginning of my career, I created DAX and it would take, hours, right? Or, at least a few hours. Now I can create DAX in, 5 minutes, I'm done. I create the table And typically I copy a screen, I rename a couple of things, and I have something working, at least a prototype. In half an hour, I'm all done with the DAC, with the attributes and everything, because I have tools. So I have these attributes which are aggregator. If you go one step further, which I was suggesting, for example, to make them even more generic, to install, for example, selectors right away, depending on some parameters that you pass. If you say you don't want a selector, you don't have one. If you just say I want one, or you put a where clause, you have one. It's all installed automatically. The amount of time you will save, I think it's worth it in the long run, even though they will have to, rely on learning about your new attributes. But if we start standardizing these attributes and even eventually make them part of standard Acumatica, we'll save, because there's a lot of patterns that you see repetitively in Acumatica. A table with having a key of a GUID, but sorted by name. A table using a key of ID, sorted by CD. You see that all the time. So these things have to become repeatable in such a way that when you create a new screen, it takes you, 15 minutes, 30 minutes to create a new screen and DAC and everything, instead of 2-3 hours, right? So.
Hey, Stéphane, have you ever started out a project where you did create some attributes for a case and decided that it was actually a bad idea and you reverted back? Do you have situations where you wouldn't recommend using a custom attribute?
I did that at the beginning because it was, it happened to me at the beginning where I started to create attributes and I wasted time just because I didn't master them enough. But once you know them and you start mastering those, you won't go back to not having attribute. And as you can see, this is one of the product I did, which is fulfilled by Acumatica. Now, look at the number of attributes I have. I mean,
Yeah.
most of my code are, well, not most of my code, but, 15% of my code are attributes. Then I have my DACs, which are very clean. If you look at I was showing you font ID. Look at that. I have AL system, AL name, AL font ID. I have probably AL description. Here I have a width. I created an attribute called AL dots. Here I have a language, and I'll show you some of those which create drop downs automatically and stuff like that. And I'll come back to that. But you can see here, look at my DAC has, about, and this one is simple, but still it has about, 10, if you don't consider the standard fields. Even those should be part of a subclass called standard table, right? So right. We would have to recreate those all the time. I mean, these days, who doesn't put a node ID and all these fields in their table? I wonder. I've never created the DAC without these 8 fields. So they should exist in a super DAC so that you don't have to think about these little details all the time. But still, we do, even though Acumatica was created, about 10 years ago at least, we still create DACs with these 8 fields everywhere all the time. At least they have their own attribute ID, right? But still, and I've done that for other projects where I have a super class of a DAC, and then all my master table are subclasses of this DAC, and I don't have to repeat. I've done it in one project. I don't always do it, but I've done it. It's a little more trickier with the DACs, but I would never go back to not create attributes. Like I said, of course, I've lost time trying to create attributes. I tried things I didn't really understand all the, the thing around it, all the events. I was not, mastering the events enough. So I wasted time, but to go back there, never.
I would like to add, perhaps, just thinking about things you could do with attributes. One thing is that you can add behavior, right? So you can use attributes to plug into the normal DAC events. And so there are attributes that allow you to do something on row inserting, row updating, things like that. So if you have that, you need that behavior or at the DAC level so that it always happens, it makes sense to put it in an attribute so it's always triggered no matter where that DAC is used. But if you need a behavior that's only required in a single graph or a single time, then it makes more sense to just add it to that event in that graph, right? So once you start using attributes, you start trying, like any tool, right? If you want to use it everywhere, you can get into those situations where it's you're overusing it. So I would say if you find yourself trying to with a behavior that you need to make it generic for all the DAGs or to happen every time, it makes sense to put it into an attribute and simplify your graphs. If on the other hand, it only needs to happen once, then it makes sense to keep it in the graph. So if you have a lot of boilerplate code, adding it in all your graphs or things like that, you could think of putting that into an attribute and reusing it like that. So anytime you need a change, you just change that logic in the attribute. So that's one thing.
Yeah, and one of the reasons to create the attributes is you might make a decision on creating a certain kind of key for a DAC or reference, and then obviously, typically when you have a table, you will have a foreign key about it, right? So you will have the master table, you've chosen a certain key pattern, you have your foreign key here, and then you decide for certain reasons, I made the wrong choice. You know, I should have had an ID, which is an int, or I should have had an ID, which is a GUID, and then you want to change that. If you started to use, if you didn't use attribute, you will have a lot of code to change if you change your mind. If I decide that this guy here, font ID, which was a string before I wanted to make it into a GUID, I basically literally change this, I change that, and I go inside here and I change this, and it fixes everything. So I changed 3 or 4 lines of code, and obviously I have to change my physical table. But then in a few minutes, you have changed your key from a string to a GUID or to an ID, int ID, and you will save time overall. And I have this project I've been working on for many years. Actually, it's a huge B2B project, and Mark knows about it. I did a presentation, and I'm still working on it after I started in 2019, just to give you an idea. So I spent about 3,000 hours on this project for a big customer. And at that moment, I didn't use a lot of attributes. And I remember we wanted to change the size of a field, which I had used a key, which was a string, and it was 10 characters. And then I needed to change it, and it was used all over the place, and I had to redo a lot of the code and go back and forth. And I forgot a few places where my field stayed at 10, and I wanted to increase it at 15 or 20 or whatever. So I had to go around and do a lot of changes to just change the size of a field. If I had done an attribute back in the days, I would have changed the attribute one place. I say, it's not 15, it's 20 now, or it's not 10, it's 15, whatever. And then I'm done. And then I change the physical table, and bam, I'm done. So again, you're bringing your code together in one place. And then there's very little code. You just use this powerful thing. And then if you have to do a change, you do it there, and it affects all your screens. And it's quick. So you're saving time all the time. Not only during the creation of your stuff, but also when you refactor things. It's much easier if you just refactor a few attributes and that's it, right?
Yep. So Stéphane, there's 2 questions. I'll let Robert go first. Robert, you have a question. Unmute yourself and go for it.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. So I definitely see both points relative to the power of attributes, and then also Yuri's concern of less newer developers actually understanding what the attributes are about. So sure, attributes allow you to write code faster, but there's generally the consensus out there is that you'll generally read code 10 times more frequently than you write code. So you got to factor in the readability of the code. And I think what would go a long way to really allowing unfamiliar developers to these attributes to be able to understand them is to add summaries and documentation to the particular pieces, explaining why you would want to use that attribute. Not the code itself is going to explain what it's actually doing, but generally what code often lacks in being able to do is explain why you're doing it. And that's what you want to get into your commentary. And that's one of the things that I see also in terms of like going through Acumatica documentation and whatnot, and these tutorials is like you'll come across this odd attribute in the middle of the tutorial, or you'll see it in code somewhere. And you're often asking the question, why? What is this attribute, and why is it here, and what is it doing? So like really there's an art in it as well in terms of reading attributes and knowing how to read attributes and understanding the fundamental .NET structure of attributes and why we do
and
declarative
then the
programming.
becomes a repository of documentation as well.
Right.
Instead of documenting each DAC property and explain all over the place, this does this does this. You do an attribute, you document it well there, and this is
exactly
easy to understand. And then you just by using the attribute, you know you will have documentation on it.
Exactly. So you can have summaries and remarks within the attribute itself, and then when you do like go to definition, you should be able to reference that. Or you could just probably have a hover tip right over top of it. If you put your cursor over top of it, you can read what's going on, and you can answer that question, why is this attribute here and why is it used? And really, if we want to speed the process of developing, we have to factor in the readability of code so that it's most understandable to somebody that is not familiar with it. Generally, if you wrote it, you're going to understand it, but 2 years down the road, you might not remember. And if you have like just a couple sentences within commentary somewhere, that might click that memory as to why that's there in the first place. So we don't want to factor in the speed by just merely the speed at which you're writing code, but you got to factor in that you got to read this code in the future, or other future developers need to read this code, and you want to convey understanding to them as to what these attributes are doing.
And even the attribute name could convey some of its meaning.
Precisely.
And then if you have less code to read, you grasp faster. And overall, if you look at a DAC, and even if you have 20 attributes, if they all speak to you, you will understand this DAC in a few minutes.
Yeah.
If you have to read and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and see all these PX default and DB, PXDB, XYZ, you know, how could you load that into your brain and try to understand it?
Yeah.
If it's one property, one attribute, it becomes very clean and very much more understandable.
Yep. So I'd like to interject here just to those points is you're basically creating a library of attributes.
Yes.
So to further make them useful for, you know, the contrary case for the new developer is document your library, right?
Yeah, document your library.
So you could, you know, if you're using Git, right? So you could publish these in GitHub or wherever you want, and then document them nicely, right? Or document them in place. But then you have your developer, you know, when you hire somebody, you would have a period of time where they study and use. You have sample code and they're explained, they're well documented, and their use would come more naturally. You can get them up to speed faster as well through their use, as long as they're documented, right? So yes. I think that's what, you know, Yuri and Robert, you know, is saying, hey, you know, but for the new developer, you know, it's not going to help. You know, they're like, what are these attributes? They're not documented. They're going to be confused. But as long as you document them well, I think that overcomes that objection.
But worst case, they don't understand it, but you tell them, oh, use the ALAD foreign attribute.
Yep.
And then they use it and then it works, right?
Yep.
And that's the other thing, because when you use code over and over and over, it becomes so well tested that you can use it, you don't have any problem. So you're creating a DAC in 15 minutes, and then it works the first time because you're all using attributes which have been tested over and over by all kinds of different projects. So how could you fail if you're using components which have been tested, right?
Right. I mean, it's like knowing
it's
like doing a new method or something. It just becomes part of your understanding of how to manipulate code.
Yeah.
To solve problems. So I want to move on to Tony. There's two. So Tony and Joe have questions. So Tony, why don't you go ahead? Unmute yourself first. There you go.
Yep. Hi there. Great stuff, Stéphane and Robert. Great comments. I agree completely with all that stuff. Readability and such. I had a question that just popped into my head. So if you look at where these are used on your page right here, for example, barcode ID. Have you ever looked into possibly, instead of using an attribute, maybe creating a parent class of BQL GUID field? That may do the same thing, you know what I mean? So if you
subclassing the GUID?
So if you created like a Stéphane barcode ID that was, and then on that, put the attribute there on the parent, and then everywhere you can just use Stéphane barcode ID instead of having to put the attribute everywhere.
I'm not sure I understand.
So if you're using, let's see, you have a barcode ID attribute, right?
Yes.
And you place that everywhere you want to have that barcode ID behavior. If you instead used a class barcode ID, not the attribute, but an actual parent class, that would be like Stéphane barcode ID. And so this barcode ID abstract class here would inherit from it instead of BQL field.
I'm not. Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So your Stéphane barcode ID would have the BQL GUID.
Oh, okay. I see here. So
And
barcode
then,
ID here would be, well, it would be,
then
but remember that the attribute is tied to the property here, because this is not just merely there. It is there to decorate this property. And that's how it got attached dynamically by Acumatica, is that the property barcode ID as an attribute. So
yeah, but if that was all I'm
it's
saying,
more like this, right?
all I'm saying, if maybe that was done in the parent, and
Well,
then
where's the parent?
it would be a new class that would inherit from BQL GUID field instead of this class. And then this class would inherit from that parent class. So then it would carry.
Yeah, but this one is a class, but this one is a property.
Yeah, that property wouldn't change. It would just be the abstract class.
You wouldn't have
maybe it wouldn't even work. You're right, but that's just an idea that maybe you could genericize it even more into a parent class. I was just thinking out loud.
Yeah, I would have to think about it.
That's okay.
I mean, nothing is impossible in the end, right? But
yeah.
Okay, so let
That's
me
okay.
go
We can move on.
Yeah.
Nothing's impossible for developers, is I think what you wanted to say, right, Stéphane? So let's, Joe, you had a question, so we'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, Stéphane, I think I know the answer to this already, but have you ever seen any performance considerations when using custom attributes, since there's a lot of heavy reflection going on and such?
I don't think there's so much reflection, and I think fearing reflection is a thing of the past. A lot of people have said, oh, don't use reflection. You know, even Acumatica developers say that. Don't use reflection. But you look at their code and they use reflection. And I've used reflection since, I can tell you, since 2001 on Java. And then when I came to C#, I started to use reflection. Reflection is a great tool. Yes, it has a cost. And there's better than reflection, in fact. And I could share that. There's a library I use all the time. Let me see. It's called fasterflect.reflect. So it's kind of a faster reflection because it uses delay. It transforms what you're looking for example, a method into a delegate. And when you call the delegate, it's much faster than reflection. But I would say don't fear reflection, use it. It's so powerful. And I don't think you will see the price. I don't think the price you pay for user reflection is that visible nowadays. It might have been in 2001, 2, 3 when we were on Java, 1.3, 1.4, but I wouldn't worry about that. There are some reflection. Of course, your aggregate has to discover its own attributes, but Acumatica, I mean, it's the same thing. If you create a property and you put multiple attributes, the property, I mean, when Acumatica builds the property in the cache, it has to discover the attributes anyway, right? So whether you discover the individual attributes on the property, or you discover an aggregate which has its own attributes to discover, I think the difference in cost, let's say processing cost, is negligible.
Makes for a fun debate.
Yeah, I guess we could certainly create a case where we could prove that if you do it like this, it's faster than that. But there's other ways. There's other things that are much lower for an application than using attributes.
Fair enough.
And and also I have not to plug my blog again, but I have the blog about the slot mechanism is one way to make things super fast. And so I wouldn't worry about that. I would worry about other things in terms of not losing and saving time, if you will, increasing the speed, the general speed of your application. So I was never worried about the cost of reflection.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you ever ran into a performance issue as you were working with customers.
No, because I have other practices like the slot mechanism. And just to give you an idea of how much I use it, I actually have a slot folder to create all my slot mechanism. So a lot of my things are done in memory.
Hey, Stéphane, can
Yes?
you just for people, because I know slots is somewhat of a more advanced topic. We had Gabriel Michaud a few years ago talk about slots, and
Yeah.
I know you did a presentation. But before we can you explain slots? But before you do, I just want to, for people that are listening to the recording, especially, or some of the people on the call now, Stéphane's referenced some blogs that he's published. So all you have to do is go to Acumatica.com, do a search on Stéphane, and you'll see the blogs that he's done, and then you can actually reference what he's talking about, what he's written, if you want to dig deeper into this.
So just to do an overview, a summary of the slot is that, so you have to think a user connects to Acumatica, it creates a session for the user, and the session, the user will do queries. And then when you do those queries, the data is stored in the cache, right? So when you read a table, you read the table, you store data in the cache. Another user comes in, he does the same. He has his own memory, if you will, on the server, and he does his own queries. And again, he does queries and it's stored in the cache. So the fact that one user has read the data doesn't help the second user and third user, unless I'm mistaken and I'm missing something, but right. So each user is obviously independent one from the other. So what the data that you read is the data that you cache, and that's it. So in some cases where you have some configuration in some tables, and all the users will be using these configuration, and these configuration don't change across time. I'm not talking about sales order and purchase order. I'm talking about, I don't know, message types. I'm talking about, for example, in my case, I'm doing a lot of substitution, data substitution. So I have some functions to do some substitution. The functions are all the same all the time, and they're the same for all the users. No matter who's using them, they're all the same, right? So they're the list. I have barcode lists, for example. Once you have a list of barcode, the list doesn't grow over time. It's always the same list of barcodes, right? So if you have one user reading the barcodes and another user reading the barcodes and so on, and you have 10 users, 20 users, 100 users, the more users you have, the more data you read, the more data you cache, and so on and so forth. So you pay the price of having more users. In my case, what the slot mechanism does is there's one single place where the barcodes are loaded. It's in the slot in the shared area, if you will, of Acumatica. I'm not an IIS expert, but somewhere in memory, there's a context where shared data is, and everybody trying to read the barcodes will actually read from the slot, and it's already in memory. And what's great about the slot is if someone goes and add a barcode to the barcode table, the slot will flush itself and reload itself automatically due to the mechanism that it's using. It's using the prefetch, and so the barcode is I prefetchable. So that means when you want to read the slot, if the slot is empty, it will actually go and read the barcodes for you automatically. And the barcodes will be in memory. Once you have read them, you can use them. They stay in memory because it's fairly small data set, right? It's not hundreds of thousands of rows. I maybe have, I don't know, 25 rows, right? And these 25 rows have, you know, a few fields, like about 10 fields. So yes, I'm using memory that stays occupied, but I'm sharing it with all the users. So even if there's 200 users, nobody's using the barcode table but the slot mechanism. So then if someone goes behind, and this is done by Acumatica automatically, if someone goes behind and insert a new row in the barcode table, the slot will flush and reread the barcodes automatically. So imagine now you're sharing a small data set and you don't need to read the table anymore. You know, taking, I don't know, half a second, 1 second to read the table, whatever the delay is on your machine. Now in mere milliseconds, you have access to data that you use and reuse all the time for processing purposes. And the reason I do that is I can't afford to do, because my application reads a lot of objects. As you can see, I have barcodes, I have content, I have font options, I have printers, margin, models, rules. And those are all configuration objects, which I need to read very often. And I can't pay the price of doing a query to the table. Otherwise, my application will be too slow. So I'm using the slot mechanism because I'm using a little bit more memory, but I'm using it once for all the users, and I'm making the processing super fast. So we're not talking about attributes, but
yeah. I just wanted to make sure that people understood what slots are, especially new people to Acumatica, or, you know, they're just, what is he talking about with slots? So that was a really good explanation. So I appreciate that. So before you go on again, I want to reach out to, say, any of the Acumatica engineers on the call who have experience with this, and maybe and Evgeny Krakow, I don't know if, do you have any comments on what you see? Is there any comments that you could make on this? I mean, you did a great presentation. Like I said early in the when I was introducing the subject, I would love to get some of your feedback and what you've seen, how Stéphane uses attributes, and gone into great detail and very impressive. I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Seeing one of our developers, you know, use attributes and how he uses them. What you think about it?
No, I mean, to be honest, I don't have any major comments here. Everything looks great, and that was a good example how to use peak segregate attributes and everything. Maybe just one small comment about reflection, because I heard that some people scared of reflection and so on. I mean, just want to clarify one thing. There is no reflection in attribute itself, right? And reflection is used to retrieve attributes associated with an attribute target. And of course, this code calls get custom attributes to list the attribute type names for the property and so on. But I mean, you don't need to worry about it. Of course, we do not recommend to use reflection. And if you have some options, do not use it because of performance and so on. But if you have no choice, that's not a problem to use it.
I mean, if you make one call through reflection, it's not the end of the world.
Right.
If you make 1,000 calls all the time to reflection, then you're going to pay a price, right? So you have to use it properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's most about that than the fact to use it or not. Is to use it properly.
Personally, I would more care about PXDB calc or DB scalar attributes that may cause dramatic performance degradations. So again, just keep everything in balance. Keep balance between performance, functionality, and everything, and try to use everything properly, and that will help you to avoid issues for sure. Yeah,
and like they say, don't pre-optimize things. You should do optimization when you have performance issues. Don't try to optimize too much ahead of time, because sometimes you will make things worse actually than enhance. Enhance things, you will make things worse. So they say never optimize in advance, let's say, right? Okay, go ahead.
Just summarizing all things together. Thanks a lot, Stéphane. Thanks for a great presentation.
I'm not done.
Okay.
I was not done.
I've interrupted him. I've interrupted his flow a bit because asking questions.
So let me go quickly. Another example of things I do selector based on interfaces. So I have some in the case of the labels, I have an interface for languages. As some of you might know, well, it's not visible here, but there's a lot of printing languages. The most known one is Zebra printing languages, but there's actually 6 or 7 major printing languages. And so in my case, I wanted to have a drop down based on a list of languages, but I didn't want to do that in a fixed way. Say, okay, I have this language, this language, this language. The thing is I want to be able to discover my languages dynamically using reflection, obviously. And so what I ended up doing, let me see here. I have not in enterprise. Version here. So I have an interface called iPrinter language, which gives me some information about a given language. And then I have some implementation of the language. So SBPL, it's one of the printing language, is an abstract language, and an abstract language implements the iPrinter language. And so what I do is I actually have, this is a selector here. It's a drop down with the list of languages. And the way you can see, there's only one line of code here. So I say that my selectable type is iPrinter languages. And I have that. Let me see if I have a couple of implementation of the same thing. I have another case here. So a printer, it's an interface. It's a drop down with a list of implementation of something, right? And they both derive from AL selectable attribute. And basically, knowing my selectable type, which is my interface, I can actually look for implementation in Acumatica. So as I deploy new languages, my dropdown will actually increase in size because it will find more and more implementation. If I deploy less implementation of iLanguages or iPrinter, I will have less values in my dropdown. So my dropdown will react to what has been deployed on the server, right? Because some customers, I will only deploy ZPL. So the dropdown will only have ZPL, which is Zebra printing language. For other customers, I will deploy other languages, and the dropdown will adjust itself based on the implementation that it finds. And the way I find the implementation, well, of course, there's using reflection, but I'm literally going through all the assemblies. And you might think that will take forever, but it's fairly fast. I mean, the dropdown appears instantly, and it displays all the languages that are available. So I'll bit of code here, but I'm finding all implementation. So when you implement an interface in multiple ways, and you want to show a dropdown of what is available, and I use that extensively, even in other projects where, for example, I have on the B2B project, we have what we call B2B processors. They're little pieces of code that process a message, and I install actually a bunch of processors on the machine. And when I go to the processor table, I have a dropdown and say, well, select one of the class that is available. And this is actually something like that. So you can see very little code. And then when I need the actual object, I can create an instance of the object by using its class that I've discovered. So that's a dynamically filled based on what is deployed on the server. So the more you deploy, the more you have in your dropdown, right? So it's really like a plugin architecture where you can add more and more implementation of a certain interface, and the more you add, the more the dropdown adjusts itself. It really literally automatically discovers the implementation that are available at any given moment in a server, without having you have to say, oh, I have this language, I have this language. There's no list here. There's no fixed list. So that's one other example. Well, a classic, custom selector. I'm sure a lot of you have done this. So this custom selector is actually, it's actually tied to the web. And I'm actually calling an API on the web to discover objects. And in this case, it's a list of printers. So let me see. Wow, maybe we don't have time to show it. So literally, I click on this selector, and it lists a bunch of printers that are declared on the cloud somewhere. So it's the equivalent of the device hub, if you will. But so this selector is a custom selector, and it's actually calling a method here called get printers by computer. And this is actually makes an API call. So it does a get on an interface, and then blah, blah, blah. So that's a cloud-based selector. So that's another example of attributes. I do quite a few of these custom selectors. What else do I have? Another one that I typically do. Where's it? I'm here. Oh, it should be here. A list of screens. So I tend to, the code that I do tends to relate to screens in some ways, like the labels. And so I have a selector. Let me see, where is it? Screen ID attributes here. So this one, yeah, this one is an aggregate, but it also has a selector, and I'm using the sitemap to get the list of screens available in Acumatica. So, and it's using the PX sitemap selector. So I can actually select a screen from Acumatica and set it on my field. What else? A couple of other things I do. I tend to create my own. I created 2 subclasses of the list. So one is a pxint list, and I actually have 3 versions of it. An abstract list, which is based on an enum. Everybody's familiar with enums in C#? So, for example, I had the there's an attribute for alignment in Acumatica called vertical align. And so you can see here, this one is actually a drop-down, which is based on an enum, which is here. So I have an enum with 4 values.
That's actually cool.
So top, bottom, center, justify. And literally in one line of code, I create a list of a drop-down list, and I list all the options. And what it does is basically, as a value, as you know, top is 0, bottom is 1. You know, it starts at 0. So what I store in the database is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But what I see on the screen is top, bottom, center, justify. So then I have this selector, this drop down, and I can literally select a value out of an enum. So I have all these enums here, which I use in my printers to print in PDF options. So I have a page size, I have an orientation. So I do all those selectors just with one line of code like this. Bam.
Can we take a look at the selector?
Yeah, but it might take a while because it's very slow to start.
Oh no, I meant like your actual base class.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean. This one. So this one is the actual selector for the vertical align, and the base class is a subclass of my abstract int.
Okay, yeah, I see.
And then what I do here is I implement get tuples.
Yep.
And I create a list of tuples. I use C# to get the values of the enum, which is here, declared here, the E.
Got it.
Which is declared. You can't say where E is an enum. You have to use, that's the closest definition of an enum is it's a struct, an I-comparable, an I-formidable, and I-convertible. So then I get the full list and I create my tuples and my drop-downs is created. And the rest is here in my abstract class.
Yeah,
which
I appreciate
is
that.
Yeah. So very quick, when you play with enums, sometimes you need, you want to drop down and you know what the values you want. You create an enum, you create an int field, you put this, you plug it in, bang, it works. Couple of minutes, you have a drop down. That works. Right? And also have this, so let me close a couple of things here. So we've seen this. So I also use, so I also have this abstract string list attributes, which is, if you will, a more dynamic version of the one from Acumatica. So instead of declaring so much code and it's complicated to play with, so there's 2 reasons why I do that. Because then my implementation becomes, not this one, it's this one here. So then I have actually multiple lists. I have the full list here. I have the full list for sample, which is another use case where I use an extra value in it. And here I have a full list for content where I actually use less values than the full list, right? So I have 3 ways to display it. The full list plus 1, and the smaller list, right? And then, so I have my typical Acumatica constants. But then what I do is I just implement my method here, the get tuple method, which returns my tuple here. And then in my other implementation, I return a variation of the list. So either a list plus something else, or less of a list, a smaller list, which is here. And then, so you see, all you have to do, you have to implement this, get tuples. And then the other thing that could be useful is it gives me access to the labels and the values in a much easier, sometimes when you want to pop up an error with a drop down and you want to say, oh, you cannot select this value, blah, blah, blah. You don't want to show the constant because it doesn't go, it doesn't create a nice message, right? So what you want is the description of the value so that you can make a meaningful error message to the user. So in order to do this, you need the value, you need the label associated with the value. So I've created a couple of methods that give me access to all the values, all the labels, and also the label of a given value. So that way, if a user makes a bad selection, I can give him a message using the description of the dropdown, not the constant, which is just typically a single character right? So again, I'm using that all over the place. I don't know how many of those I use, but look at that. That gives you an idea how much I use it. So now I can go to any of those.
I use a lot.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see here I have a print quality drop down. I have two values, and I return them here, my tuples, and I have my two values here with my message. So it becomes very clear. You read this, you understand quite right away. You don't have anything else to implement other than this. And you can see I'm using it all over the place. Reuse, 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 reuse. Don't repeat yourself. The dry principle for me is key to being a good developer. Do not repeat yourself. Reuse and save time, and use code that has been tested thoroughly. So save development time, save testing time. And that's pretty much it. Barcode. So this one I've discussed. Yeah, the aggregate. And that's it.
Awesome. That was a nice master class. And so we talked about attributes and how they're used, but there's some bonus material here. You get to learn a little bit about slots, and you got to learn a little bit about enums. So the discussion kind of went into a couple other areas and how they're related to attributes and how you can be clean in your code, simplify your code, reuse your code. Why keep rewriting the same stuff and a variant of it when you can use attributes to simplify? But then, people raise the point about, well, if I have a new developer on here, it's not clear how it's documented, and but as long as you have these library of attributes and you've documented them well, that shouldn't be an issue. But there is a balance.
I mean, what is there that is difficult to understand in one line of code that says it's a drop down? I called it enum list attributes. Sure. It could have been called enum drop down, and I'm passing an enum at the end. I mean, it's very simple. One line of code, and I have a drop down.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. Naming conventions go a long way in readability. Yes.
And as you can imagine, I have to start everything with AL because that's the prefix that was given to me by, I chose it. Yeah, it was chosen for Asgard label. So everything is called AL. No choice here. So, but you can see the number of attributes that I have. It's a lot of the code is there. And I save time because when I need to introduce a new table, it's bing, bang, 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 bang.
Yeah. All right. So there's only like about 9 of us left because we went long, but that's great. It's like, to me, is I can watch a 2-3 hour movie as long as it's good, and analogously, this is great stuff. So I don't care if it goes on for 3 hours. We're not, obviously, but it's a lot of good material. I appreciate it. But of those of you remaining on the call, any closing thoughts that you may have? Was this useful for you? Did you learn something? I learned a lot. Did you?
Yeah, I thought that was really cool. And that, again, the drop downs are something that is like #1 boilerplate, I feel like.
Yeah, send me an email. I'll send you the code for the enum and the others.
Sweet, thank you.
No problem.
Yep. Anyone else before we end the session?
I have a short comment. Yeah, personally for me, it was very interesting to see how other people use our attributes and everything. Yeah, that's a great experience for me. Thanks a lot.
And thank you, Acumatica, for having created a platform which is using attributes, because I love them. I mean, I think it's a leap forward in terms of development frameworks. It's which is called aspect programming, and you don't see that a lot these days. We're still somehow in some frameworks we're still 20 years behind. But this, for me, is really it gives a lot of value to the platform. Not always easy to understand, but in the end, you end up getting it, and you see the mastery behind the product. Really.
Yeah, you're welcome. And as you mentioned, the main reason here is that good developers, they don't want to duplicate their code, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
One thing I would suggest, though, is try to put a little more comments in your attributes, because sometimes I really don't understand what it's trying to do.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we're working on that.
Yeah, I know.
We're always trying to improve our documentation.
Yeah, but I'm sure with the new development advisory committee, we'll probably put something in place to maybe improve documentation and some pieces of code that you have, and we'll do that together. So it will help everyone, in the end.
All right. Anyone else before we hang up and call it a day? Well, call it an hour and a half.
I think one good example that we could go through, and it's fine if we don't have time now, but or we could take, in the beginning, we have a business entity that we need to create from scratch, and how can we use these custom attributes that Stéphane has mentioned in order to decorate all the nodes in this abstract business entity with all the required, or at least the minimal attributes, and perhaps extend on that, how we could hook in the interfaces for all the perhaps for one of the for example, how to hook in to the row selecting event, so this attribute can be the attribute can be exposed to other parts in the ERP. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think the starting point would be to create a NuGet package with the basic stuff like what you have seen. Obviously, we would rename that, but the AL name, AL description, AL active, and AL ID and whatnot. To start creating a NuGet library that everybody could download and use. And that would be a starting point. Then we would improve on that library over time, and it would save time to everybody. So, I mean, we have to share this. Otherwise, you might be reinventing the wheel on your side, and me too, and someone else too, and Yuri too, and Robert too. So we have to share more of this stuff.
Right? Let's create this library. Sounds great to have
I'm looking for someone who has knowledge about how to create a NuGet library. I've tried. It's not so easy because of course you have to create the code, but then you have to package it into the library and deploy it to a public server and stuff like that. Yeah. But once it's done, we'll know the pattern, and so I think that should be. We should start an initiative, because I don't have the knowledge to create it. I'm using a lot of NuGet libraries, but publishing them, I have no idea.
Yeah.
So maybe that could talk to Tony. He wrote a blog post on it.
Yeah.
Did he?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tony, you're on the call still. It looks like you still there. You're muted if you're hearing me and speaking. Maybe Tony stepped away and didn't realize he was still on the call.
Tony.
But we can follow up with Tony on this. I'm going to stay on the line for just a minute. So I just want to thank Stéphane. Awesome job. It was a master class in attributes. I think if people are watching this to the end here and you're hearing me speak, go to Evgeny Krakow's presentation on attributes. and go through that. You've listened. If this has been a little too complex for you to absorb everything in it, go to Evgeny's presentation. I'll post it in the vlog that I create over this, so I'll put it in the there so you can click on it. Go through that presentation and then rewatch this episode, and I think you'll get a lot out of this. So thank you very much, and appreciate all the work you did in preparing for this, Stéphane, and everyone else for their comments. And Evgeny, thank you, because without your presentation, I don't think we would have necessarily had this discussion now. And so I think it's good timing. So thank you for the work that you did, a year and a half ago. So thank you as well for elucidating this for our developer community, over a year ago. And then now, I think together with Stéphane's, code examples and going through and talking about the pros and cons and people's comments, I think this is a really good session. So thank everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stéphane.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Good job.
Thank
Yeah,
All right.
Mel.
thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Fantastic.
Marco.